All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get this meeting kicked off, and welcome to our April 28th end of the month meeting already. Welcome to our Zoom meeting. It's great seeing everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'll just give a thumbs up there. We are currently right now we're almost at 90 members, and I'm sure we'll gain today. We have a very interesting program today. So thank you all for being here today. Just a couple quick, I guess we'll call them housekeeping items. Just make sure your phone is on mute. If you could do that, and you can go ahead and turn your speaker to mute as well. You can hit your space bar if you want to ask questions at the end of the meeting. You can do that as well. I have a list of some folks that we'll welcome for our visiting Rotarians and our visitors today in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe and get the meeting kicked off with our song and pledge. Thank you for that, and we'll move forward, and we'd like to join Lori Vidal for our invocation today. Lori, take it away, sir.
There we go. All set?
You sound great.
Good. It's really good to see all these faces today, and you know, in this day and age we're going through right now, it's just let's enjoy the fun of just seeing one another. Let's have a word of prayer together. It is such a beautiful day today, and we thank you for your incredible provision for us with a day like this, just to enjoy, even in the midst of the pandemic we are living in. Give us a fresh perspective today of what we are being called to be and to do to assist in moving our community to a place of health and well-being. We continue to pray for those in the medical community for their service in the midst of such stressful conditions. Grant health providers grace, wisdom, and perseverance for each day. And sustain those who are providing essentials for our needs, exposing themselves to added risk. It's a good thing to be together for our Rotary meeting online, at least seeing one another and being further informed to the status and needs of our community. Make us ever open to serving one another. Teach us to be better listeners and to listen well to others. May we be making a difference in our community, I pray, in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lori, as always, every week. And I did not mention before, as a reminder, if you are a visiting Rotarian, if you could please go to the chat bar in the middle of your screen at the bottom, just click on that. We'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself if you could just click on that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move right into some of our visitors today that we have. And we've got a list of visitors. Looks like, Wesley, I've got the last one that you just sent me. So if I miss anybody, Wesley, just shoot me a chat or let me know. And if I get your last name a little funky, that's on me. So sorry. Let's see. So welcome, Michael Levy. We've got Dr. Megan Gracie's here today. So welcome. Brian Jose, Marie O'Gronley, William Winter. We've got Christine Atug and Susan Maston. So there you go, Richard. Got the boss here today. Welcome, everybody. And if I missed anybody, I'll take just a minute and look in the chat box. You can always put something right on there and let me know. But it looks like Susan Maston was our last visitor today. So welcome. Glad you all are here, and we're looking forward to a great program. All right, any visiting Rotarians? You can unmute your sound bar and jump right in. Okay, and with that, we're going to jump into our announcements today. It looks like TJ, you're up first, sir. Go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's well. We were going to be having a Zoom social on Wednesday, May 6th. We have largely Richard to thank for this. He was really the driving force behind getting us together again in a more social setting. During that meeting, we're asking folks to have a drink or cocktail in hand and then write down in advance 1 or 2 activities that you've been doing either outside or online that have helped you get through the stay-at-home order, and then also ideas for service projects that either we can do as a club or people can do individually that also need to observe social distancing guidelines. So that's going to be Wednesday, May 6th at 4:30. You'll get an email. We encourage everybody to go ahead and sign up. One of the things I've really enjoyed about all these Zoom meetings is seeing the insides of people's houses. So I think if we're lucky, Jason Shank will be on the call and we'll be able to see inside his mansion and maybe pick up some decorating ideas for all of us. But we hope to see you Wednesday, or we hope to see you virtually Wednesday, May 6th at 4:30. Thank you.
And TJ, thank you. That'll give me a good excuse to leave the office a little early and come home and broadcast from the Shank living room. Should be a lot of fun. So thank you. All right, that sounds like a lot of fun. So Wednesday, May 6th, 4:30, we're going to have a Zoom happy hour. If David, you could drop off a growler at my house in advance, that'd be great. So thank you for that. All right, so next announcement, we have Richard. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And yeah, thanks, TJ. That's going to be a lot of fun. And next week's going to be kind of busy because we're going to have, I think, 3 Rotary-related Zoom meetings next week, in addition to the social on Wednesday and our regular Tuesday meeting. We're also going to have, at some point, haven't quite pegged down the date or the day and time for it next week, but we're going to have a special Zoom meeting with the presenter from the CPA firm of Carr, Riggs, and Ingram. And it's going to be a special Zoom meeting that's focused specifically on business owners. So we're encouraging you to invite anyone that you think would benefit from joining that meeting. And the CPA firm is going to walk us through the COVID-19 related loan options and relief packages that are available to small businesses. We'll have lots of time for Q&A. So the meeting is going to be very specific to the businesses who are in the meeting with us. And you're very welcome to invite anybody that you think would benefit to that meeting. Again, that's going to be a separate meeting from our regular Tuesday meeting. Our regular Tuesday meeting next week, we have a labor attorney who's going to walk us through some of the considerations that businesses will face as they start to reopen, trying to keep both employees and customers safe. So it should be a really interesting week coming up. Again, the special meeting for the business owners, as soon as we have the day and time of that locked down, we'll send an email with meeting details and the Zoom link for that. Thanks, and Jason, back to you.
That sounds fantastic, and thank you. I'm looking forward to that as we have many of our frontline team interacting with a lot of customers. So any additional ideas and advice we can get to keep our customers and team safe is great. So looking forward to those meetings coming up, Richard. That sounds fantastic. All right, and with that, we'll move right in and turn the meeting over to President Chad. President Chad, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Jason. I only have one announcement before we start our meeting today, and that announcement is Elder Care of Alachua County is in a position where they have funding for meals, but not transportation to deliver those meals. So if you are interested in learning more, email me or Jason. Basically, they're looking for individuals that are available any day, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. if you have a car and you're willing to deliver. So get in touch with me if that sounds like something you would like to contribute to or get involved in. And Richard, would you introduce today's speaker, please?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Chad. So our speaker today is Dr. Fred Southwick. He's a professor of medicine and former chief of infectious diseases at the University of Florida College of Medicine. Dr. Southwick joined the U.S. Hospitalist Division in 2016, serving as the division's patient care quality and safety officer. He's an infectious disease expert, a patient safety advocate, and a champion for improvement in our healthcare systems. He's also an associate editor of the Journal of Infectious Diseases and is the author of the textbook Infectious Diseases, a Clinical Short Course published by McGraw-Hill. Dr. Southwick's been concerned about misinformation being shared about the COVID-19 epidemic, and today he's going to share with us the key information that he thinks we need to know about COVID-19. And we're going to have lots of time at the end of this for questions and answers. So we're really grateful to Dr. Southwick for presenting to us today. Please join me electronically in welcoming him.
Thank you, everyone. I really am very honored to be invited by Richard. And I come to you from a different point of view. I'm not coming from you as a University of Florida professor, but rather as actually a patient advocate. And I'm also the chapter leader of the Right Care of Alliance of Gainesville, which is an organization dedicated to actually improving access to everyone to healthcare. And one of the things we've seen with the COVID-19, that those that don't have insurance have suffered greatly. And as an infectious disease specialist, I wanted to share my perspective of this outbreak. I actually completed my fellowship in 1980. So I have been practicing infectious disease for 40 years, and this particular epidemic is the most frightening that I have ever encountered. And in those 40 years, because the infection, this is a highly infectious agent. It spreads easily from person to person, and it has a high mortality rate compared to other viral illnesses. Now, I don't want us all to be frightened, but I have to tell you, a little bit of fear is an important thing to have, because if you do not respect this, if you do not respect the science, you can become part of that epidemic. And as we begin to lighten up on our shelter in place, it's very, very important that we keep in mind the potential dangers as we begin to open up. Now, I'm going to give you a really whirlwind tour. It's going to be quite quick. And I'm going to go over, first of all, I just want to present a patient for you. And this is a patient I'm still caring for in the hospital. I've changed some of the details. And by the way, these are my opinions. These don't necessarily reflect those of the University of Florida or UF Health. So this particular patient, I changed a lot of the specific details for HIPAA, but I am taking care of a woman approximately this age who presented with shortness of breath for 6 days and had a history of asthma. 9 days before admission, she was exposed to a COVID-19 patient while working in the orthopedic clinic. 7 days before admission, she developed fatigue, a temperature of 102 and shortness of breath. And on hospital day, she was noted to have a fever of 103, a respiratory rate of 28. Normal would be 14, so twice normal. And her oxygen saturation in her room air was 93%. It should have been 96%. She was wheezing, and on chest x-ray, she had areas of pneumonia in both lung fields. On hospital day 2, she became more hypoxic. Her saturation was 93% on 4 liters of oxygen. On hospital day 4, her respiratory rate jumped to 38. She was severely hypoxic with saturations down to 82%, required intubation, and was placed on 70% oxygen. And in order to ventilate her properly, had to actually be placed in a prone position. That's on her stomach with a respirator with ventilatory support. Days 5 through 14, she has remained on a respirator. However, the good news is she no longer needs prone positioning, and actually they're weaning her off sedatives as of today, and we hope to extubate her in the next 1 to 2 days. So this just demonstrates the personal consequences and how we really need to respect this infection. Now, where did this start? This is a coronavirus, and it turns out there are 7 human coronaviruses. 4 are very mild, and they've been around for years. They basically cause a cold, a viral URI, and 1/3 of all viral URIs are coronaviruses. However, in 2004, a more highly pathogenic, that is a virus that caused more serious disease in humans, showed up in China. And that was called SARS-CoV. It was called SARS at that time. It had a mortality of approximately 15%. And then in 2013, the next serious coronavirus showed up, MERS, and that occurred in Saudi Arabia. And that particular infection has a mortality of 30 to 35%. And then finally, in December of this year, again in China, the SARS-CoV-2 virus showed up. And the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2 is called COVID-19. The reason it's called SARS-CoV-2 is because when you look at the sequencing of the virus, it is closest to SARS. It's also very close to a bat coronavirus called RATG13. It has a 96% identity. And so it's related to the bat. And what we've realized is bats, when the virus grows in bats, for reasons that aren't totally clear, the mutation rate goes way up. And what we think happened is there was a mutation that favored its ability to infect humans. And then it got, the bat infected a intermediate mammalian host, probably a pangolin. And the pangolin was sold in this live market where workers came in contact, probably touched it as they were skinning the animal. And then it began to spread within the market. And I'll go over the spread a little bit later. Now, a little bit about the virus structure. This is called coronavirus for crown because you see these little knobs, they appear like a crown. And the knobs are made up of a protein called S protein or surface protein. And that's where the major mutations occurred in the bat virus. And it caused the S protein to bind very, very tightly to what's called an ACE2 receptor on cells that line the bronchi and line the actual lung the lung parenchyma and the alveoli. And when it binds with high affinity to these human cells, it then is, as you'll see in this diagram, it is actually, once it's bound to these receptors, it's taken in by what we call endocytosis. The membrane surrounds it, it comes into the cytoplasm. There, the RNA from the virus is replicated by a replicase. Then part of the RNA is actually transcribes specific proteins, including the S protein. And the RNA continues to be replicated, forming little nuclear capsids. They bind to the endoplasmic reticulum, form actually little vesicles, and those vesicles then are exocytosed, spread to new cells, and also get into the sputum and the saliva. Now, once they're in, it's spread into the air, into the saliva, they're generally either you touch your nose or you breathe in droplets, and they begin multiplying in the upper airway, in the nasal passages, in the pharynx. And for the first 24 to 48 hours, there are high numbers of organisms, of virions, but little in the way of symptoms. Then after 24 to 48 hours, they begin to spread down into the bronchi and into the alveoli, little air sacs that are important for exchanging oxygen. And what happens is the virions get into those cells and damage those cells as they infect them and lead to a breakdown in the walls of the alveoli and causing leakage of fluid. As the alveoli fill up, the ability to exchange oxygen dramatically decreases. And over time, with the inflammation, the alveolar walls can become thick or fibrosed and scarred, further impairing oxygen. So the major manifestation of this disease is inability to exchange oxygen in the lungs and hypoxia. Now, how does the virus spread? Well, it spreads, as I inferred, by droplets associated with coughing. And when you look at these droplets, generally they're fairly large, and they will drop within 1.5 centimeters and generally will not spread beyond 6 feet. However, recent studies suggest that if you sneeze powerfully, they can go up to 6 meters or greater than 20 feet. And that's why we now, distancing alone probably is not sufficient. And that's why it is now recommended you wear masks in public. Also, with some sneezes, there can be aerosolization, and singing causes aerosolization. And these are smaller, less than 10 micron droplets that can hang in the air for up to 3 hours. The other key point is that when the droplets land on surfaces, they can survive for up to 3 days, particularly on stainless steel and plastic. As far as the stool goes, it can be, PCR can be identified, but it's very difficult to culture, and there has been no documented spread from stool, and there has not been no spread from pregnant women to the neonate. Now, the transmission is predominantly by droplets and possibly by also touching surfaces and contaminating your hands, touching your nose, your mouth, or your face. And the big problem that was not initially appreciated is that a significant percent of people that are carrying it in their nose have no symptoms. They don't know they're sick. And the Diamond Princess, a cruise ship from Japan, was the first place this was studied. And they found 600 people that were infected on that ship. 18% of them by the PCR was positive, and yet the person had no symptoms. Subsequently, we found that 40 to 60% of individuals may be asymptomatic. Those more likely are younger. Those adolescents and young people have a much higher asymptomatic rate. Up to 60% was found on the aircraft carrier. There is also a danger of what's called a super spreader, someone who spreads these droplets very aggressively. And there's a case 31 in South Korea where this individual came from China, visited Korea, visited a mega church twice, had a car accident, ended up going into the hospital briefly in the emergency room, and then after that developed a fever and actually went to a buffet dinner. The investigation revealed that that person infected 1,160 contacts. Now, what about the transmission? We talk about R sub 0. That is, the infected person infects, on average for this disease, 2 to 2.5 people. So the R sub 0 is 2 to 2.5. And this usually occurs within a 7-day window. What we found, and this was true in China, is 80 to 85% of those contracting infection do so within families, family clusters, and 10% of those close contacts do develop disease. But large gatherings, such as cruise ships, mega churches, and if you happen to be in a room with someone who has symptoms, you can become infected. And it turns out, if you're in a room with someone who's asymptomatic talking to you, they can spread the virus to you. Now, the initial outbreak occurred in a Hunan market, a live animal and fish market, and beginning in December. And what initially the yellow shows, these are workers, predominantly workers were infected, but within 10 days, the majority of the people were individuals that had not been in the market, indicating that very quickly it went from a point source, where coming in contact with the animal, to human spread, person to person spread, and it indicated very, very quickly the Chinese knew this was a highly infectious agent. So what happened? It rapidly spread from that market and that city to the entire province. Then these are 10-day intervals. You can see the spread rapidly went to other provinces and eventually involved the entire east coast of China. And quickly also spread throughout the world. And when it went to Italy, particularly, it was a major site, and from Italy to the United States, but also from China to the United States through Seattle. And as of yesterday, there were 3 million confirmed cases and 209,800 deaths. And I suspect the deaths and I suspect the United States has 180,000 as of yesterday, and I suspect it's now over 1 million. Now, I show you this is an image, and this was actually just drawn for me by Bruno Lucchese, and this is called Pandora's Jar. And what happened is this virus was left, the Pandora's Jar was left open, and the virus spread very quickly throughout the world. And when you look at the epidemic curves of the different countries, there is a tremendous difference in the curves, because some people chose to quickly close Pandora's jars and others left it open, feeling that it was not a danger. The country that closed it most quickly, one of the countries that closed it most quickly, was China. Within 30 deaths, they closed. Australia closed quickly. Norway closed quickly. South Korea closed quickly. The United States, in some areas, has still not closed Pandora's jar in some states. The United Kingdom delayed. Italy, who had the largest number of deaths, waited till 800 deaths before they decided to shelter in place. So a key lesson is you must move very, very quickly, because the growth is exponential. And early on, it looks like very, very few, but you keep doubling. And when you get to the steep part of the curve, it's too late. As you can see, with aggressive case finding after following the sheltering in place, that China is now down to almost 0 deaths. And you can see that South Korea, who also did a huge amount of testing, is also down to a very low number of deaths. Now, here is the United States as of yesterday. And you can see New York City, 160,498 cases. The second largest is actually in Chicago now with 30,000. Detroit, or Los Angeles, is third. Detroit is fourth. Miami is fifth. New Orleans and Seattle. Seattle was actually the first, and they've gotten very good control over their infection. And so they have not had a particularly large growth of organisms. Now, I also looked at Florida early on, and this is March 9th. You can see at this point, it looked very mild, but the worrisome thing that was showing up all over the west coast of Florida. And then you can see that it quickly, this is each day, it began spreading more. And you notice Fort Lauderdale began to pick up. And then Miami began to pick up. And then you see there is a marked increase down in the southeast of Florida. And when I calculated the doubling time of cases at that point, it doubled, the number of cases doubled every 1.8 days. Now, since that time, we have been sheltering in place. And here is the data as of yesterday for Florida. The doubling time now is 12 days. And so we've really slowed the epidemic. And Alachua County, which actually sheltered in place very quickly, we're down to a doubling time of 14.5 days for the doubling of cases. So we've really flattened the curve for both Florida and Alachua County. Now, as of February 25th, prior to February 25th, China had most of the cases. Since then, it has been far exceeded by the rest of the world. Now, what is it like to have COVID-19 and how do you diagnose it? Well, the 58-year-old woman actually illustrates many of the symptoms: marked fatigue, fever, shortness of breath. The one thing she did not have is a dry cough, which is very, very frequent. Temperature is most common, but dry cough is second. She had a rapid elevated respiratory rate, developed hypoxia, and required intubation because of her severe oxygen exchange in her lungs. If you look at this, is 1,099 cases from China, published in the New England Journal. Fever is present, and this is all cases. This is milder cases. This is severe cases for the dark bar. And you can see in all situations, fever is present in 95% of patients. Cough is present in about 70 to 75% of patients. And it's initially dry, but later on it can become a wet cough. And that seems to be similar for all severity of illness. Shortness of breath, however, is only present in about 12 to 15% of milder cases, but is present in 38 to 40% in severe cases. So when you get short of breath, that is a worrisome sign. Fatigue is very common, muscle aches, loss of sense of smell, headaches, rare vomiting, and nausea can occur. Now, we teach our medical students an illness script, which are 4 components that we like to always go over. First of all, epidemiology. In this case, is as the person traveled to an endemic area. Have they been exposed to someone that was infected? Did they, were they in a large gathering, such as a megachurch or cruise ship? Secondly, how was this rapidity of onset of illness? And generally, this disease is acute to subacute. That is, it develops within, symptoms come on quite quickly within 2 or 3 days, or subacute within 5 to 7 days. And the key symptoms are fever, sometimes chills, dry cough, and shortness of breath. And when you get shortness of breath, that's worrisome. We also worry about past history. If you've had hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or pulmonary disease, you do much worse when it comes to this particular infection. Now, we diagnose using polymerase chain reaction, a PCR, and that's where you heat and cool and amplify the message of the COVID-19. And this is an accurate test. Its specificity is 99%. However, its sensitivity is only about 70 to 80%, probably because of sampling. So if you have a negative test, it could be 20 to 30% of the time, it could be a false negative. This has been a problem. Now, initially, it was recommended you only do the test in somebody who is symptomatic. But it has become clear in this article in Science, which was a simulation, but has been supported by multiple studies now on the ground. For every single diagnosed case, there are 8 to 9 asymptomatic, undiagnosed patients. So the bottom line is you cannot do too much testing, and you really need to test everyone because anybody could be infected and could be spreading the infection at this juncture. Now, let's look at what happened with testing in the United States versus Korea and Italy. This is actually in March 12th, and this looks at the number of tests that were performed. South Korea, remember that has the very flat line, is almost to zero. As of March 12th, they had tested 274,000 people. At the same time, the United States had tested 25,000 people. Now, if we were to do the same amount of testing per capita as South Korea, we should have performed at that juncture 1.75 million tests. So we have had a huge problem with testing, and we still have a problem with testing. And this is going to be very, very important as we back off our shelter in place. Now, what's the course of illness? It turns out that 40% of patients who are infected is very mild, 40% have moderate symptoms, 15% severe, and 5% critical. Those that are critical have about a 40% mortality, and 38% of those in the severe and critical end up being intubated. The duration of hospitalization is long. It takes a long time to get over this. Non-severe, average of 11 days in China, and for severe disease, 13 days. And it's very hard to predict who is going to die. However, underlying illness certainly is a major risk factor, as is age. So here is our patient I described before. This is what her chest x-ray on the left looked like. And you see there's zones that are quite clear where the x-rays go through with some opacifications later on. This is on day 8. You can see that the lungs are almost completely white. And that's what happens. And it's called acute respiratory distress syndrome. So the usual incubation period is 4 to 6 days after exposure. 40% are mild, 40% moderate, 15% severe, and that's defined as requiring 4 liters of oxygen to maintain oxygen level, and 5% are critical, and they have a 40% mortality. In addition to ARDS, there can be organ failure and a sepsis-like syndrome caused by what's called a cytokine storm. Now, as far as age and mortality, it's very clear that there's a strong relationship with age. At under age 30, it's rare for anyone to die. From 40 to 49, it's about 1 to 2%. 50 to 59, about 2%. 60 to 69, 4%. 70 to 79, 8 to 10%. And those over 80, anywhere from 16 to 24%. 24% was the figure in Italy. So how do we treat this organism or this infection? Well, since most of the patients are mild to moderate, we want them to stay at home if possible, because there's no benefit from hospitalization until they get significant hypoxia. If they develop shortness of breath and you need to monitor them at home, then if they have severely moderate disease or critical disease, then they will require hospitalization. Now, it's very difficult to decide this on your own, and so there are hotlines. You can call your primary care physician if you're getting symptoms, or you can call Alachua County Department, which also has a hotline and can triage you appropriately by asking the proper questions. This is a decision that should be made by a healthcare professional. Now, the major treatment, and I'm going to summarize a huge amount of data, is oxygen. You want to maintain this O2 saturation above 92%. All other therapies, including hydroxychloroquine and various anti-AIDS medications, even remdesivir, have not been proven to be efficacious at this juncture. And as far as the vaccine, maybe a year, but it looks like it's going to take at least 18 months. And until we have a vaccine, we are not going to get this infection under easy control, and we are going to our life will not be the same until there is vaccination. And I know Craig Fugate gave an excellent discussion of social distancing, and I agreed with everything that he had to say. But let me go through the Imperial College COVID response team's simulations, because I think they're very helpful in allowing you to understand this. There are 5 techniques for non-pharmacologic control of a virus. Isolation. All infected individuals need to avoid contact with others and wear masks. So you need a good test to determine who's infected. And remember, there are a high percent that are asymptomatic. Quarantine. Individuals who have come in contact with those infected individuals need to stay away from others for 14 days. Social distancing for those over age 70 is one approach, so that those that are more highest risk will not get infected. Or you can socially distance the entire population, and that is shelter in place. And then 5, close schools and universities and non-essential businesses. And so if you use all 5, you will get suppression. That is, the R sub 0, one person will infect less than one other person, and the epidemic will remit. Mitigation is where you do isolation, quarantining, and shelter in place, but you let the universities and businesses open, and you will have R sub 0 that's greater than 1. So what happens with the different scenarios? The black line here, this is the number of critical beds that will need to be occupied. And if you do nothing, you see it's a huge number. For this case, there were 14. The health system in this scenario had 14 possible ICU beds. You can see you get up to 220, totally outstripping the health system. If you were to do this, which we have not done, the estimate was 520,000 individuals in Great Britain would die, and the United States would be 1.2 to 2.4 million. If you use the mitigation strategy, you will see that and this is just a magnification of the upper graph, you see initially you will stay underneath the healthcare capacity for ICU beds, but over time it will exceed, and actually in late about October, November will go far exceed the health system. If you use suppression, you see the green line, you stay way below, and then the problem is that once you relax, there will be jumping up of cases again, and you have to have some trip that will tell you. Some people recommend a certain number of ICU beds. When they become filled with COVID-19, that's when you have to go back to your suppression strategies. Now, another way of doing this, which I really like, and I would recommend that we begin to think about, is using an electronic thermometer called Kinsa. And it connects with an iPhone, and then your temperature goes to a central data bank. And this was used in influenza back in 2018 and actually published in peer-reviewed journal. And here were the number of visits due to a influenza-like illness. And here is the number of patients in that region that had a fever. And you can see they almost perfectly correlate. The R value correlation coefficient was 0.95. And here is actually a map of Florida using these temperature maps. And as you can see, the southern Florida, the temperature exceeds that to be expected, as it does in Orange County where Orlando is, as it does in Tampa, as it does in Jacksonville. And you can see Alachua County is a little bit high, but not to the extent of these other cities. So one other comment, the role of antibodies. What happens is shown in this graph. These are antibodies in critically ill and mildly ill patients. You can see that the antibodies, IgG, immunoglobulins go up within 10 to 14 days, and then they peak about day 28. And so there is a good response. And right now there's a debate whether this confers immunity or not. But the big problem is this only will assess whether or not you've been infected. It won't tell you if you're still contagious or not. And at this point, we aren't sure if it confers protection. However, when enough people develop immunity, then we will get herd immunity, and that's what a vaccine will do. The big problem is that of the 14 tests, there were different ELISA tests or immunoglobulin tests that have been performed, only 4 were felt to be accurate. So there's a lot of bad tests out there right now. So we have flattened the slope. So now what should we do? Well, one of the big problems, we are a democracy. We aren't like China. So in order to actually continue to control this epidemic, each of you, now that you understand the facts, will need to lead. Healthcare professionals and concerned citizens have to explain these key facts, and apply organizing methods to encourage testing, case finding, and social distancing. So the key watchwords once we stop shelter in place are test, trace, and separate. And the other key thing is you must listen to the scientists. This information takes expertise. Gut feelings have no place here. And one of the ways that I think and I'm trying to do is share personal stories of patients. As physicians, we see the consequences and we want to share our stories. And we want to find like-minded champions. I think it's important to write editorials, speak to friends, talk to leaders, and have virtual events like this and listen to and embrace science. Now, I'm reading this book called The Decimeron. It's from Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio, written in 1350, and it describes the Black Death. And what I'm shocked to find out, actually, I'm not that surprised, that the same things that are occurring now were occurring then. And those that ignored the Black Death died. Those that heeded the shelter in place and careful isolation survived. So listen to the epidemiologists, listen to the infectious disease experts. And with this information and with these methods, you can make a difference. And finally, I just wanted to list resources. I actually have an entire course on Coursera outlining all these facts and many more. The Right Care Alliance, if you want to join our local branch and the national branch. And we're also having journal clubs to discuss health systems and how it relates to COVID-19. So thank you very much. With that, I will end.
Jason's vanished. Let's see, we have a few questions here.
A lot of information.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Southwick.
I'm back, Mr. President.
Sorry to hear that.
I think this is your part, though.
Let's see. So, Dr. Southwick, we have a question. Do you recommend that everyone purchase a pulse oximeter to monitor oxygen levels, and how accurate are these devices?
I think that is important to consider, because it turns out what we're seeing is that the way you sense shortness of breath usually is your lung compliance, your elasticity of the lungs gets worse. Your lungs feel tight. And the second way you experience shortness of breath is elevations of carbon dioxide. You tend not to respond to low oxygen. It turns out that in this disease, carbon dioxide levels are normal and compliance of the lungs early on is normal. So you may have quite serious disease and not feel it. The O2, the oxygen saturation will go down significantly before you get symptoms. So if you really want, in fact, I told my wife, I actually purchased, I went on Amazon last week after reviewing all this data. I personally purchased one. You can get them on Amazon for $30. So now the problem is if you have chronic obstructive lung disease and already have hypoxia, or you have heart disease and congestive heart failure, mild levels of it, you may get low levels, and that might get you worried, and it may have nothing to do with COVID-19. But I'm also recommending that our nursing homes be monitoring oxygen saturations in addition to temperature, because fever may be intermittent and is not as reliable as actually low hypoxia. So O2 sat monitor, I think, is a good idea.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Is UF conducting or planning to conduct a comprehensive study of the symptomatic and asymptomatic population in Alachua County to get a handle on the local prevalence of the disease?
Yes, Glenn Morris, the Emerging Pathogen Institute, is trying to do broad testing. I think they're going to focus first on healthcare providers and also patients that are coming into our hospital. When you think about it, if these patients are asymptomatic, they can come in for some other complaint, and you will not realize they have COVID-19. And so if our healthcare providers aren't wearing masks, they can become infected. So it's really important to test all patients that are coming into the hospital, as well as all providers. And then if we have enough test capacity to actually test large areas, geographic areas, to determine the percent of people that are asymptomatic carriers.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Southwick. We have more questions. Are you able to stick around for a little bit longer?
Sure, I'm happy to stick around. I'm sorry, I tried to shorten this as much as I could, but there's just, in order to understand it, you really have to go through all phases of the illness.
You did great. Thank you so much for speaking to our group. We really appreciate you being here today. And on behalf of our club, we will make a donation in your name to inoculate 100 children from the polio virus.
Right.
So thank you so much. Richard, would you tell us a little bit about next week's meeting?
Yeah, and I'll make this really quick because this is a great meeting, and I want to be able to get back to the questions really quickly. But our speaker next week is going to be Paul Donnelly. He's a labor attorney with Donnelly Gross, with other states beginning to reopen businesses, and with Florida likely not far behind. Businesses are going to need to know how to prepare. How can they reopen yet protect their employees and their customers as well as possible? So Paul's going to walk us through a number of the steps that businesses may want to take, as well as some that they're required by law to take. What happens if an employee doesn't want to return? What can businesses do if customers won't respect the rules? These are some of the questions that we hope to have answered next week during the program. And I invite you again to feel free to invite any business people from the community to join that meeting next Tuesday, as well as the special meeting that we're doing with the CPA firm. These meetings are open to everybody, and hopefully they're informative and helpful in the community. And so please invite as many people as you can. It's a great way for us to get the message out there. And thanks. With that, I'm going to go back to you, Chad, I guess, to keep the question, or to Jason, to keep the questions going.
All right, thank you, Richard. So it's about 1 o'clock, so we will officially adjourn the meeting now for those of you that need to go. But if you'd like to stay, we have a number of questions that I'll keep asking Dr. Southwick as long as he's willing to stay and answer them.
I'll answer them all.
All right, thank you so much. So the meeting is adjourned. If you'd like to stay, please do. The next question is, what is our confidence level in information and data that we receive from China?
I think it's quite good. They may have hidden a few things, but I think they learned from the original SARS outbreak. They were chastised and criticized by the entire world, because a normal tendency is when you have an outbreak to hide it because you're a little ashamed of it and you don't want to look like your country is dirty and dangerous. But they released material so very quickly. They had the virus fully sequenced within about 8 days. It was just amazing. And what for me was a very positive thing is, University of Florida trains a lot of Chinese scientists. Those scientists have gone back to China, and we actually benefited from their skill sets, because they jumped on this very, very quickly. And if you look at the number of publications that are being shared, both in peer review and then there's an MDRX, where online things that have not been released yet are shared. They are sharing tremendous amount of material, and they have actually tried to send protective equipment once they were were no longer shut down. They have ramped up. So maybe I'm an optimist and maybe I believe in people, but I truly believe that the Chinese have made every effort to share their information. Now, there's been a big discussion about whether or not this was released from a lab by accident. And I actually have heard several discussions on that. And the short answer is impossible. It didn't happen that way. It happened through the bat mutations. And the nice thing about molecular biology, if you do a full sequence of that viral genome, you can trace exactly where it came from. And it came from the bat, and it went to it actually came from that market. And the problem I have is, why do they have these live markets, animal markets? These are where all these bad coronaviruses have come from. It turns out coronaviruses are wide throughout the animal kingdom. Every animal almost carries these coronaviruses. Often they're not symptomatic. And in the bat, they're usually not symptomatic. And that's one of the big problems with these viruses. So having live animal markets is just asking for trouble.
Thank you. How long after symptoms stop are you still contagious? There was an article that
Go ahead.
someone read that suggested up to 37 days.
It's a real problem. One of the problems is the PCR, which is the way we're assessing whether or not you're infectious, is what it's doing is measuring RNA. It cannot determine whether or not it's a live virus. The only way to determine if it's a live virus is to actually culture it. culturing is complicated and we're too expensive. So the PCR, yes, can stay positive for a very prolonged time. And until we have more studies of asymptomatic and people that have recovered, we can't say for sure. One of the best ways to actually get around this is once you no longer coughing and your symptoms are gone, if you wear a mask and everybody else wears a mask, the likelihood of you spreading it to someone else and you wash your hands is very low. I would say anybody that's had it probably should be wearing a mask afterwards, just for that possibility.
All right, thank you. Can COVID-19 result in permanent lung damage?
There is, in the later phases, there are X-ray studies that show elements of fibrosis and scarring. I have not seen any studies to follow up on those individuals after they've recovered. In general, viruses don't cause permanent damage to lungs, but it's possible. I think the jury is out. I can tell you that a lot of patients feel very weak and wiped out for weeks and weeks. So this really can be a very, very serious infection, and people can feel very compromised for a long time. They don't get back to themselves. The other thing that I didn't mention, but there seems to be sometimes what we call an encephalopathy. There's involvement of the brain to a certain extent, and individuals they won't feel mentally alert and won't feel as sharp as they used to. And that is one symptom that can develop. It's such a vague symptom, it hasn't been really quantified very much, but that's definitely an encephalopathy is another associated symptom with this infection.
All right, thank you. This is a bit longer question. Numbers can be misinterpreted based on how you look at them. For example, deaths in Alachua County have increased by 100%, but the underlying facts are that we went from 1 death to 2, and that our overall mortality rate is less than 0.7%. There was a chart depicting daily death tolls, which showed the US at 2,000, far surpassing some of the other countries shown in the graph. Do you have a graph that shows the number of deaths on a per capita basis or the mortality rate based on the number of confirmed cases?
The per capita is, I know a lot of people want per capita, and it turns out from an epidemiologist standpoint, to follow curves and decide what to do generally is not as helpful. The concern in the United States is you look at if I go back to the curves, we have a large number of people dying daily. And the problem is when you look at cases, confirmed cases by PCR, that's fairly inaccurate because it depends on how much you test, and it depends on the accuracy of your test and your sampling. However, a death is a death. And so you're able to really follow the curves more clearly by deaths than any other way. And looking at the overall number of deaths, and in any one area, you can see initially it's exponential. And then when it flattens out and goes down, that is probably the most helpful to determine whether or not you're getting better. So I really like you take a certain area and it's a relative number, and whether or not it's going up or staying flat or going down is probably your most helpful number.
Why is taking someone's temperature a good strategy when people may be spreaders when they do not have a fever?
Well, we don't, they can have a low-grade fever. We don't know that. And what we found is that 95% of people that are infected do have a fever at some time. Now, when they happen to arrive in the emergency room, about 40% don't have a fever. However, subsequently do get a fever, and they may have had a fever earlier. So I think one of the key things to do, and that's why I like the Kinsa, is I recommend, and I think this is a good strategy for when people go back to work. Every morning, your workers should take their temperature. And the other thing that is important is everybody's actual set point is a little bit different. For instance, I've been checking mine with the Kinsa thermometer. I know that my average standard in the morning is 97.6. That's my temperature. Other people, my wife, Kathy, hers is 98.4. So if I go to 98.4, I should worry, but she wouldn't. So if you watch your temperature every day at the same time and you see a trend upwards, I would recommend you tell your worker not to come in. This virus definitely stimulates the immune system, and it causes it can do it excessively stimulated, and that's what causes this cytokine storm. That's your cytokines are immune hormones that tell your macrophages and your neutrophils, your host cells, go on the attack. We've got a foreigner here. And it really stimulates, this virus really stimulates that. May be intermittent, but in most cases, you will pick up a fever if you follow it regularly every day. So I think that is a very helpful to do. And I mean, one of the issues is always our rights of privacy. And this is a big issue. What are we going to do when we get a license and we have some individuals have high antibody titers, others do not? What are we going to do when we know someone is infected or maybe a carrier? Should we be willing to put that on an iPhone? And then should people be able to know if we're coming close to them to respect others who are not infected? I mean, these are some of the questions I don't have answers to. But I think, I think these need to be debated, because I don't think anybody really wants to infect somebody else. And so if there are methods where we can stay distanced from those that might be infected or might have a fever, that would be helpful. One of the things that's happened is shelter in place is an extremely blunt instrument. It has shut down everything. It has been a financial and economic disaster. We would like to have a finer way of keeping those that are infected away from those that aren't. And that's where case finding and isolation, testing and isolation of those that are infected and quarantine those that have been exposed, if we have a low enough cases to do that, is the fine way of preventing. And then one of the other issues that comes up is, okay, your employee is PCR negative now. How often should you test them? It's recommended now, possibly every 7 days, because you might come in contact with somebody that you didn't know was asymptomatic. That's why I purchased masks for myself. I don't go out of my home without a mask on, except if I'm walking outside where everybody's 6 feet away from me. If I'm going to any closed environment, there's too much risk. And the cloth masks, I think they've actually looked at, there's an article in Nature Medicine compares the paper surgical mask to the cloth mask, and they're almost equal when it comes to COVID-19. They aren't as good for rhinovirus, but for influenza and COVID-19, they're almost equal. The beauty of a cloth mask is you can wash them, you can recycle them, and you can have a few on hand all the time. And if I'm going out, I wear a cloth mask. The other thing you can do is they have little pockets where you can put paper dish towel in, which even adds another element of protection. Now, one of the things that I tell our hospitalists, I say, none of these things are perfect. But if you're wearing these, you reduce your likelihood of a large inoculum. In other words, inhaling a large number of variants. It's becoming clear to epidemiologists, although it's not published, if you inhale a large number of variants, you get severely ill. And that's what happened I had a respiratory therapist who was working in the hospital. She was only given a surgical mask at this institution. She was changing a trach tube. It got aerosolized. She got a huge dose. She is very, very ill, and she's now intubated, and she's in the intensive care unit. And that's why we're seeing healthcare providers that don't have the proper equipment are in particular danger of being exposed. So the inoculum counts. So even if your mask doesn't totally protect you, you might only get a mild viral upper respiratory infection, and then you will have immunity. So I really recommend wearing masks and washing your hands very, very frequently. I think that can save you from serious disease.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Southwick. I appreciate you being here today. We all appreciate you being here. What a great presentation.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.